They say water remembers. If that's true, then that lake held every version of me, quiet mornings with my wife, before her illness fishing with my boy, before he moved out west, and countless moments alone on the dock when I needed to clear my mind. The lake wasn't just a body of water behind my house. It was history. Mine, my family's, and this community's. I moved to Oak Hollow 15 years ago after retiring from the Corps of Engineers. Not many people think of civil engineering as military work, but I'd spent a good portion of my life managing dams and reservoirs overseas, holding back disaster in places the news barely mentioned. So when I bought the small stone house with the faded green shutters and the dock that curved gently into the lake, I thought I was finally coming home to stillness. The HOA was quiet back then. A few retired folks who just wanted to keep the grass neat and the mailbox colors uniform. Nothing fancy. They barely enforced anything, which suited me fine. The lake was technically community property, but my property bordered its widest section. I built a bench there with my own hands, cedar sealed against the rain, and nobody minded. The lake shimmered different every season. Spring brought the frogs and dragonflies. Summer, the occasional canoe. In fall, mist rose off the water like a memory rising from sleep, and winter. Winter was when it went still, glassy, like it was listening. That's what made it hit so hard the morning Scout growled at the waterline. Scout's my dog part, shepherd part, mutt all heart. He saved me more times than I've saved him. That morning in early April, we were doing our usual loop around the back trail when he stopped low, growl building in his throat. I followed his gaze to the shoreline. It had pulled back. I mean visibly, tangibly. The water used to kiss the edge of the stone ledge where the dock started, but now it sat nearly 3 feet lower, enough to expose a swath of wet mud and tangled weeds that hadn't seen daylight in years. At first, I tried to explain it away. No heavy rains in March. Maybe the runoff was slower than usual. But I'd lived long enough with the rhythm of that lake to know when something was natural and this wasn't. Back at the house, I pulled the historical level charts I kept from when the previous HOA president, Mr. Carlson, asked for help identifying lake seepage issues years ago. I'd mapped the water table trends across 4 years and even modeled evaporation loss in dry seasons. None of it accounted for this drop. Someone was draining the lake. I walked over to the south bank later that afternoon near the overflow channel. There it was, a pipe jutting out like a bone from the bank, angled perfectly to divert water away from the retention basin and into the dry gully that bordered the far end of the neighborhood. That pipe hadn't been there before. It was new. Installed recently, sloppy welds, exposed trench scars. I took pictures, logged GPS coordinates, measured flow rate with a handheld reader I still kept from my field days. The next day, I showed up at the HOA office, a bland beige building beside the clubhouse, with a file folder under my arm. Linda, the new manager, didn't even look up. "You need an appointment, Mr. Hargrove." I told her it couldn't wait. She sighed, picked up the phone, and 5 minutes later I was ushered into a small conference room where 3 board members sat arms folded. At the head of the table was Brad Whitmore, late 30s. Former tech sales guy turned self-appointed property czar. Ever since he got elected HOA president last year, he'd been pushing modernization plans. More security cameras, drones, digitized violations, power washing the sidewalks every 2 weeks, whether they needed it or not. I laid out my documents, photos, flow calculations, a brief summary of local hydrology patterns. Someone installed a pipe into the southern retention outlet. I said, "It's draining the lake." They looked at each other, and then Brad chuckled. "Are you serious?" "I am," I said. "You think we're siphoning off the lake like some cartoon villain? Come on." "I'm saying the water level dropped 3 feet in less than a week, and there's an unauthorized pipe bleeding it into the gully," I replied. "If you didn't authorize it, then someone's acting illegally. If you did authorize it, you may be violating both county watershed codes and the covenants of this community." That wiped the smirk off his face. "Do you have any idea how paranoid you sound?" one of the board members said. "I spent 20 years managing water in combat zones," I said evenly. "This lake is bleeding out, and if you don't act now, you'll kill it." Brad stood. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. We'll look into it." But I could already feel the cold wall going up. I left the folder behind, on purpose. Let them stew on it. That night, I sat on my bench by the lake with Scout curled at my feet. The moon caught the surface in long silver lines. But it wasn't enough to hide the scars, the fresh mud line, the absence of gentle lapping at the dock's legs. I'd seen rivers dry out from upstream manipulation. I'd seen entire ecosystems collapse when engineers cut corners. But I never thought I'd see it happen in my own backyard. And not because of war or weather. Because of arrogance. Because some men think their spreadsheets know more than the land. The next HOA newsletter arrived the following week, digitally, now since paper was wasteful, under Brad's new sustainability initiative. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, scrolling through the PDF on my old tablet. There it was, sandwiched between a paragraph about pressure washing the tennis courts and a cheery photo of Brad posing next to a trimmed hedge. Water Optimization Project Phase 1 completed. The HOA has successfully improved lake drainage and erosion control on the southern shore. Residents can expect better mosquito mitigation and reduced flooding risks moving forward. My blood ran cold. Improved drainage. That's what they were calling it. I knew what that meant. That pipe I'd seen wasn't unauthorized. It was intentional, sanctioned. And worse, it was only Phase 1. I read on eyes scanning too fast for comprehension, like watching a car crash in slow motion. They had plans for new landscaping around the lake, controlled runoff systems, and a water feature redesign that involved reshaping the shoreline. Excavation may cause temporary closures to trail access, it said. Excavation. I set my coffee down hard enough to rattle the table. Scout looked up from his corner by the fridge, sensing the tension. They're not just draining it, I muttered. They're gutting it. I went back outside, walking the trail that hugged the perimeter of the lake. Early spring had left a film of pollen on the water, but now the pollen clung to dry mudbanks. Tadpole pools were marooned in shallow puddles, their futures evaporating by the hour. Across the lake I saw them. 3 men in neon vests, shovels, marking stakes. A little bobcat parked on the trail, its engine still warm. They were expanding the drainage. One of the workers looked up and waved. I didn't wave back. Instead, I marched straight home and opened the covenant documents from my purchase folder, 15 years old, still filed neatly in a weathered accordion binder in my study. I flipped through pages of legalese until I found it. Article 4. Common areas and environmental protections. It stated clearly, any modifications to shared natural resources must receive 80% homeowner vote approval at a public hearing. There had been no hearing, no vote, no notices. Just a newsletter after the fact. I printed out the relevant pages, circled the language, and wrote a letter. I took it to the next HOA meeting in person. Brad stood at the head of the room again, flanked by his usual lieutenants. Folding chairs scraped the clubhouse floor as a handful of residents filed in, mostly retirees. Some young couples, a few faces I didn't recognize. Let's begin, Brad said, with that same smirk he always wore like a badge of superiority. When it came time for resident comments, I stood up. I'd like to speak on the Water Optimization Project, I said, holding my papers in one hand. Brad sighed. Mr. Hargrove, we've already addressed. I have here Article 4 of the HOA Covenants, I continued. It requires a homeowner vote before any modifications to the lake. That never happened. A murmur passed through the room. A woman in the back whispered something to her husband. Brad took a breath, still smiling but tighter now. The board determined that the project qualified as routine maintenance, he said, which doesn't require a vote. Routine maintenance doesn't involve excavation or re-engineering the shoreline, I countered. That's not maintenance, that's modification. Another ripple of whispers. A man near the window nodded. Brad's jaw twitched. The HOA has consulted with our landscaping partners and legal counsel. We're confident in our process. Then you won't mind if I bring this to the County Water Authority, I said. Let them decide if draining a public access retention lake qualifies as routine. Silence fell. For a moment, Brad looked like a man who'd miscalculated the room. Then he leaned forward and said into the microphone, Mr. Hargrove, your tone is bordering on hostile. If you continue disrupting these meetings, we'll have to file a behavioral violation. Gasps. That was a threat, and everyone in the room heard it. I stared at him. File whatever you like, but I'll keep speaking. That lake doesn't belong to you. It belongs to all of us. That was the moment things changed. Not officially, not publicly, but I saw it, the flicker of doubt in the residents' eyes. The way Mrs. Blanton, who'd always kept her distance from me since her husband passed, leaned forward like she wanted to say something. I left the meeting without another word. The next day, I got a letter in the mail, certified. Violation notice disruptive behavior at HOA meeting, level 2. Fine $250. I laughed, out loud. Scout barked once in agreement. They were going to war with me over a lake, my lake, but they hadn't read my file. They didn't know that in a box in my attic was a binder full of environmental permits, sediment studies, and erosion control models I'd drawn up for work in Kandahar and Sierra Leone. They didn't know I'd testified before congressional subcommittees on watershed safety. They thought I was just a grumpy old man with a bench and a dog. Let them think that. The quieter I was now, the harder it would hit when I raised my voice again. I began with respect. I always do. I've learned that warnings, no matter how urgent, fall on deaf ears if they're delivered with contempt. So I tried patience. I tried diplomacy. But when people are drunk on power, especially petty power, they don't hear words. They hear threats to their illusion of control. After receiving the violation notice, I filed a written appeal attaching copies of the HOA's own covenants and highlighting the specific article requiring community votes on environmental changes. I included a diagram of the drainage pipe's flow path and a side-by-side satellite image showing the lake's visible shrinkage in just 3 weeks. I walked it down to the HOA office myself and handed it to Linda, the manager. She barely glanced at the envelope before sliding it into a stack of other paperwork like it was a coupon flyer. "Brad's out," she said. "He'll get to it." "How long before the board reviews an appeal?" She shrugged. "Usually at the next meeting." "That's in 3 weeks." "Correct." "The lake may not have 3 weeks." Her fingers paused on her keyboard. She looked up. "Are you threatening the HOA, Mr. Hargrove?" I laughed, but it had no humor in it. "I'm trying to stop you from killing the thing that gives this neighborhood its name." Oak Hollow Lake wasn't just a pretty patch of water. It was the basis for property value, the centerpiece of the community's marketing, and the reason half the residents moved here in the first place. Every brochure used that same stock photo sunlight glinting off ripples, kids feeding ducks, canoes slicing through calm mornings. But Brad didn't care about that. He didn't grow up with respect for land. He grew up with apps and quarterly goals and slide decks that said optimize every third sentence. So I escalated. I emailed the HOA listserv, careful to avoid inflammatory language. Just the facts, the drop in water level, the environmental clause, the absence of a vote. I attached photos, measurements. I signed off with my credentials not to flex, but to signal that I wasn't just an angry homeowner, but someone who knew how hydrology worked. The replies trickled in slowly. A few thanks for sharing or interesting, didn't notice the drop, but nothing concrete. Until Mrs. Holcomb from Lot 17 emailed back, "I've lived here 22 years and I've never seen the lake this low. I thought it was just dry season. If they're draining it on purpose, that's not right." Others followed. A young father wrote me saying his kids used to fish off the dock, but now the fish were gone. A woman who jogged around the lake said she noticed a smell like algae and rot. Someone else forwarded the newsletter and asked, "Is this what you meant by Phase 1? It gave me hope, a fragile spark of it. So I took it one step further. I went door to door. Not every house, just the ones I knew had direct lake access or backed up to the trails. I brought a printout of the satellite images, a one-page summary of my findings, and a calm demeanor. Some welcomed me in. Others politely nodded but kept their screens shut. But by the 10th house, word had spread. "You're the lake guy," a teenager said, answering the door in a basketball jersey. "Guilty. My dad says you're right, that it's drying up. Tell your dad thanks for keeping an open mind." Still, not everyone appreciated my efforts. A week later, I found my cedar bench by the lake had been vandalized. Spray paint. Ugly words? The kind you wouldn't want your kid to see. There was also a new violation notice taped to my front door. Unapproved distribution of printed materials. Level 1 violation. No fine this time, just a warning. Scout growled when I pulled it down. I didn't tell him what it said. Dogs don't need to carry that kind of weight. I spent the evening sanding the bench clean. The slurs were gone, but the scar in the wood remained. I kept going anyway. I attended the next HOA meeting armed with a thumb drive containing my full report charts, photos, soil impact projections. I offered to present a 10-minute summary. Brad didn't even put me on the agenda. "I'm sorry," he said, voice syrupy through the microphone. We're short on time today. Perhaps next meeting. I stood up anyway. I'll be brief, I said, plugging the drive into the projector. He tried to stop me, but the room was watching now. And the board hadn't officially closed the public comment portion. I clicked through the slides, letting the evidence speak. Water lines, flow rates, comparative lake levels. I ended with a quote from the HOA's own founding charter. The preservation of shared natural resources shall remain paramount to the association's duty to its residents. The room was quiet. Brad's face was red. Are you finished, Mr. Hargrove? He asked. Depends, I said. Are you listening? He banged the gavel. You're out of order. But the damage was done. After the meeting, a couple approached me in the parking lot. Retired teachers. They told me they'd been here since the community was built and that what was happening to the lake was criminal, if not illegal. They offered to help, said they'd start asking neighbors too. Maybe gather signatures. We're not lawyers, the man said, but we care. And we remember when people used to listen around here. I thanked them. Drove home. Sat in the dark on my porch with Scout at my feet. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, reflecting nothing but starlight and uncertainty. It was shrinking, but so was the silence. The first retaliation came the very next morning. I woke to find two uniformed men, contractors, not cops, staking a bright orange sign into my front lawn. It read, in bold block letters, "Notice, non-compliant landscaping violation pending review." Scout barked furiously through the screen door while I walked out barefoot, still holding my mug of coffee. The men didn't make eye contact. One of them handed me a carbon copy form before stepping off my property like I was radioactive. According to the citation, my yard was in violation of HOA Standard 7.2, unmaintained perimeter edging. Perimeter edging. I stared at the flower bed along my driveway, where the mulch was fresh, the hedges clipped, and the stone borders perfectly aligned. It looked the same as it had every year since I moved in, pristine, inoffensive, and absolutely compliant. This wasn't about landscaping. This was punishment. The letter in my mailbox later that day confirmed it. 3 violations in total. 1. Unauthorized landscaping modifications. 2. Disruptive behavior at official meetings. 3. Distribution of unsanctioned materials. Each carried a $250 fine. Total $750 due in 15 days or risk legal collection through HOA lien authority. They weren't even hiding it anymore. I didn't pay. Instead, I compiled documentation for each violation and sent a registered letter to the HOA board contesting all 3. I included time-stamped photographs of my yard, the recorded meeting transcript showing I had spoken during the open floor period, and a scan of the community bylaws, which stated no approval was needed to distribute printed information among residents. A week later, I received another notice. This one declared I was now classified as a repeat offender subject to accelerated enforcement action. What did that mean? According to the attached packet, access to HOA maintained facilities suspended. Invitations to board meetings revoked. Legal fees may be assessed at HOA discretion. I called the HOA office. Linda answered, her tone robotic. You'll need to direct all correspondence to the enforcement subcommittee, now Mr. Hargrove. Who's on that committee? I'm not at liberty to say. Of course not. Opaque bureaucracy. That was their shield and their weapon. I knew better than to scream into the void, so I shifted tactics. I met with other residents quietly, casually, never in large groups. We talked over coffee during walks after church. I asked questions, listened, took notes. A picture began to form. Mrs. DeMarco had been fined $300 last month for improper fence paint, even though her fence matched the HOA's approved palette. She filed an appeal, denied. The Tanners got a warning for unsanctioned garage use because their nephew played drums there after school. Another man, Jorge, told me his car was towed from his own driveway for being non-operational, though it was just waiting on a battery replacement. Cost him nearly $1,000 in fees and impound charges. One by one, these stories aligned. Different details, same underlying theme. Control. The HOA under Brad wasn't about community preservation. It was about dominance, micromanagement, silencing dissent. And now I was their symbol of resistance. They weren't just punishing me, they were making an example of me. So I gave them a reason to escalate. I printed 150 flyers titled, "How the HOA is Draining Our Lake and Our Rights." and place them in mailboxes under the cover of early morning fog. No sensationalism, just evidence, photos, quotes from the covenants, contact info for the county water authority, and a direct link to file complaints. That same evening, 2 security guards knocked on my door. Private security hired by the HOA. They handed me a cease and desist letter. Said if I placed one more unsanctioned document, they'd report me to municipal code enforcement. On what grounds, I asked, barely able to suppress a laugh. They didn't answer, just turned and left. Scout watched them from the window, like a sentry. That night, I got a call from Dana. She used to be my wife's best friend before the cancer took her. Hadn't heard from her in months. She lived 2 streets over, kept to herself mostly. Brad came by our house, she said. When? This afternoon. Said you were spreading dangerous misinformation. Said you were unstable. I closed my eyes. He's going door to door now. Trying to poison the well, she said. But people are smarter than that. You're not alone, you know. I didn't reply for a moment. I think part of me had forgotten what that felt like being believed. Then she said I filed a complaint with the county water board, a real one. Used your form. That meant something. Because this wasn't about just me. It wasn't about one man and a lake. It was about the slow erosion of shared spaces of quiet dignity, of neighbors trusting each other to do what's right. They wanted me silenced, fined, labeled. Instead, I was becoming something worse in their eyes. Credible. The retaliation would get worse, I knew that. But so would the momentum. Because water doesn't stop just because someone throws rocks into it. It finds another path. So would I. The lake didn't vanish overnight. It died like something being slowly exhaled. Day by day, the shoreline pulled farther inward, exposing dark veins of muck and long dead roots that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. The dock that once floated with ease now hung over cracked, shrinking puddles like a rib cage jutting from a carcass. Neighbors stopped walking the trail. The frogs stopped singing at night. Scouts stopped wading into the shallows there was nothing to wade into. By late April, the cattails had turned yellow. A sticky algae bloom spread across the surface like rot crawling across skin. I saw birds swoop down and change their minds, wheeling back toward the trees, as if the water no longer recognized them. And the smell. God help us, the smell. It started faint, like wet leaves left too long in a gutter, but soon grew into a sickly sourness that clung to your clothes and burned your sinuses. I saw joggers cross to the opposite sidewalk when they neared the lake. Some wore masks. Some just stopped coming altogether. Still, the HOA held the line. Brad sent out another newsletter, this one with the headline, "Low water levels due to seasonal variation. No cause for alarm." They blamed climate patterns, drought, natural cycles. But I'd lived here 15 years. We'd had dry springs before. Never like this. In one of their weekly blasts, they cited a NOAA report, taken wildly out of context, trying to claim the evaporation was within expected ranges. I read the same report. It was about desert reservoirs in Arizona, not suburban lakes in the mid-Atlantic, with 30% tree cover and a stable watershed. I wrote a rebuttal and emailed it to every resident I could. Some replied with thanks. Others didn't respond. But the real response came quietly through whispers at the mailboxes, soft nods from dog walkers, and second glances toward the lake with furrowed brows. Then came the fish. I remember the first one, bloated silver belly to the sky, drifting near the northern cove like a warning. By the end of the week, there were dozens. The HOA tried to clean them. One morning, a crew of teenagers in orange vests arrived with nets and latex gloves, scooping them into black garbage bags. But the fish kept coming, and with them the press. A local freelance reporter snapped a photo of the scene, dead fish lowered waterline, and in the background my cedar bench and a sign that read, "HOA caring for our natural spaces." I didn't plant that irony. Nature did. 3 days later, the article hit a community blog. What's happening to Oak Hollow Lake? It wasn't investigative journalism, but it asked the right questions. It quoted 2 anonymous residents who expressed concern over recent water levels. One of them, I was sure, was Dana. The article ended with a call for a town hall discussion. Brad responded swiftly with dismissal and mockery. He sent an all-resident email that began, "It's unfortunate that a few disgruntled individuals are spreading misinformation and causing undue panic. The board assures you that everything is under control." Then, as if to prove how little he thought of us, he added, "Our environmental consultants remain confident that these fluctuations are temporary and not a result of HOA action." That word, fluctuations, infuriated me. The waterline was down over 4 feet. The southern inlet was bone dry. And yet to Brad, this was a fluctuation. The next weekend, I visited the dry basin where the pipe had been installed. I wore waders and brought a soil probe. I took samples of sediment water, temperature readings, pH levels. I documented everything. What I found confirmed what I feared. The pipe wasn't just diverting water. It had triggered erosion in the deeper silt beds, releasing anaerobic gases and killing off the bacterial balance that kept the lake's ecosystem alive. What was left was stagnant toxic sludge. A few days later, a child from the north side was taken to the ER with a rash after touching the water. The HOA called it an unfortunate coincidence. That's when the fear finally started to crack their armor. More residents began to speak up. Mr. Tanaka, who lived across the lake, confronted Brad at a meeting demanding to know why the original drainage project had no vote. The Crawfords' quiet retirees, who never made a fuss, stood up and read a letter from their doctor stating that the air quality around the lake had triggered their daughter's asthma for the first time in years. And through it all, I stayed quiet. I let the consequences speak now. Let the lake scream in silence while the board squirmed in denial. Then came the survey. An anonymous homeowner launched a digital poll asking one simple question. Do you trust the HOA's handling of the lake? It got over 80 responses in 2 days. 72 said no. Brad called it a coordinated smear campaign, but he was rattled. You could see it in the way he stood at meetings, shoulders higher, voice, tighter laughter, forced. He started deflecting blame to legacy drainage issues and previous board's poor maintenance. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. But then he issued another violation. This one was different. It claimed my unauthorized soil collection and testing posed a liability to the neighborhood and may result in legal action. That's when I stopped playing defense. That night, I opened a filing cabinet in my garage and pulled out a manila envelope sealed with tape. Inside was a list of names contacts from my years consulting for the Department of Natural Resources. And a letter I had written months ago but never sent. It was addressed to the State Environmental Protection Bureau. And this time I mailed it. Registered mail, certified, with copies of everything. The water was vanishing. But so was the HOA's grip on the narrative. It didn't take long after my letter reached the State Environmental Protection Bureau for the pressure to mount. 2 weeks later, a white government vehicle rolled through Oak Hollow with green lettering on the side and official state plates. A woman in a blazer, sunglasses, and heavy field boots stepped out and walked the lake trail with a clipboard in hand. Her name was Elaine Turner, senior investigator. She didn't knock on my door, and I didn't expect her to. That's not how these things work. But I watched from my porch as she walked the perimeter, paused at the southern bank, jotted something down, and took photos of the drainage pipe. By dusk, the HOA's group email lit up with a new message from Brad. Residents may have noticed a state vehicle on site today. This was part of a routine inspection following recent heavy rains and concerns over natural erosion. There is no cause for alarm. Heavy rains. We hadn't had more than a drizzle in weeks. The only thing raining in Oak Hollow was public outrage, and even that came in trickles thanks to the board's censorship efforts. But then something happened that even I didn't see coming. Brad called an emergency HOA meeting. His tone in the invitation was unusually measured, almost humble. We want to address misinformation head-on and open a productive dialogue. I showed up to the clubhouse 15 minutes early and still had to stand in the back. The room was packed, residents young and old, folding chairs filled people lining the walls. I saw neighbors I hadn't seen in years. Even folks who usually kept their heads down were there clutching coffee mugs and frowning toward the stage. Brad stood at the podium with 2 other board members and a projector screen behind them. He cleared his throat. Let me start by saying we hear your concerns, and we want to clarify some of the misconceptions surrounding the lake. He clicked to the first slide, a chart labeled Annual Rainfall Oak Hollow, 2019. A blue bar graph showed a modest decline over time. This data, he said, shows that what we're seeing isn't the result of HOA projects, but rather a broader weather trend impacting the region. Polite nods, a few furrowed brows. I raised my hand. Yes, Mr. Hargrove. I kept my voice steady. That chart shows rainfall, not lake water levels. Do you have any hydrological data on actual volume displacement since Phase 1 began? A pause. Then Brad smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. We're not hydrologists, Mr. Hargrove, but we trust the experts we've hired. And who are they? Outsource Environmental Solutions. I heard the whisper ripple through the room. Outsource, a landscaping company. I'd seen their trucks, mowers, and leaf blowers, not water scientists. And is this the same company that installed the drainage pipe? I asked. Brad hesitated. Yes, under board supervision. So to summarize, I said, turning to the room, the HOA hired a landscaping crew with no documented expertise in watershed management to engineer an unvoted drainage alteration, which coincided with the lake dropping over 4 feet, the ecosystem collapsing, and a state investigation being triggered, and now you're blaming rain. That broke the dam. Murmurs erupted into voices into anger. Someone near the front shouted, "We want a vote on this board." Another added, "You lied to us." Brad's microphone cut out briefly as he fumbled with the cable. Then, desperate, he tried to shift the blame again. There's also been a campaign of misinformation, he said. One resident in particular has undermined confidence in this board through illegal soil sampling, anonymous flyers, and exaggerated claims. We believe this individual has created unnecessary panic. You mean me, I said. All heads turned. You can say my name, Brad. A silence fell like a curtain. I stepped forward. I've lived here 15 years. I've paid dues on time, mowed my lawn, voted in meetings. I even helped your predecessor fix an erosion problem on lot 29 years ago. You want to call me a troublemaker? Fine. But what I've done is ask questions, the same ones all of us should have been asking from the beginning. Dana stood beside me now. We trusted this board, she said loud and clear. But we didn't elect a dictatorship. We didn't elect silence. Others joined in, the Crawfords, Mr. Tanaka, Mrs. Holcomb. One by one, voices lifted. And Brad, his mouth tight, eyes darting, looked for someone to rescue him. No one did. Elaine Turner, the state investigator, was in the back corner, arms crossed. I hadn't seen her slip in. She was watching everything. By the time the meeting ended, Brad didn't take questions. He left through a side door, trailed by 2 board members who looked like they were having second thoughts. The next morning, a state-issued notice of compliance violation was posted on the HOA office door. Failure to secure environmental permits. Unauthorized modification of a shared water resource. Pending fines. Pending enforcement. Brad released a statement claiming the board had acted in good faith and blamed inherited issues from prior management. I received an apology letter in my mailbox the following day. Not from Brad, from one of the newer board members. A typed note on plain paper. Mr. Hargrove, I regret not speaking up sooner. You were right. We're working to reverse the damage and cooperate fully with the state. Thank you. It was unsigned, but I didn't need a signature. I had the lake, or what was left of it. And more importantly, I had the truth. Elaine Turner didn't wait long. By the end of that week, state-issued notices began arriving at residents' mailboxes, not just the HOA office. Each one bore the seal of the Department of Environmental Protection and a formal tone that made the gravity unmistakable. You are receiving this notice as a stakeholder in an ongoing investigation regarding the mismanagement of a protected water resource under shared jurisdiction. Your cooperation is requested for future restoration efforts and public hearings. For the first time, the HOA wasn't just answerable to us. They were answerable to Gish, the state. And it was about damn time. It didn't take much to accelerate the probe. Elaine contacted me directly a few days later, not as a resident, but as a technical witness. I'd attached enough documentation in my letter to warrant a field assessment, and my background in hydrology gave me standing as a formal contributor. We met at the lake just after dawn. The air smelled faintly of rot and algae, but the water had stabilized, likely due to recent rains, and the board finally halting all modifications. Elaine stepped into the mucky grass in steel-toed boots, clipboard in hand, and asked me to walk her through everything. I showed her the drainage pipe, the cut runoff channels, the erosion marks along the banks, and the red flag indicators in the sediment. I gave her my soil samples, which she said they'd fast-track for lab analysis. Did they ever file permits for any of this, she asked. Not to my knowledge, and I've been digging. Same here. We found 0 filings in the county office, no environmental impact review, no engineer of record signature on anything. That's criminal negligence, I said flatly. She nodded. Could be. Depends what the state attorney decides. But we're building a case. She paused, looked at the water, then added, You did the right thing, Mr. Hargrove. Most people just complain. You documented. You organized. I didn't say anything. The truth is, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired, worn down. Like an old dam holding back more than water. But I nodded. Thanks. The community, meanwhile, was beginning to shift in a way I hadn't seen since I first moved in. People who had kept to themselves started talking over fences again. Parents warned their kids to avoid the water, but they also began asking each other questions about HOA processes, budgets, meeting minutes, elections. For the first time, they weren't afraid of the board. One Saturday, I saw a dozen neighbors gathering near the lake trail with gloves and trash bags. Someone had posted a cleanup day in the local forum. No board approval, just residents taking back their space. I walked over with Scout and joined them. We picked up trash, pulled invasive plants, and dug up some of the debris washed down from the dried inlet. Dana showed up too. She brought lemonade in a cooler just like my wife used to during the summers when the kids would run barefoot around the docks. I can't remember the last time this place felt like a neighborhood, she said. Me neither. A few days later, Elaine called again. The lab results were back. The lake had elevated nitrogen and phosphorus levels consistent with artificial disturbance, likely from sediment exposure and equipment runoff. Combined with the rapid water loss, it created a near-fatal blow to the aquatic ecosystem. The state moved quickly after that. An official cease and desist was filed against the HOA, halting all landscaping or infrastructure work near the lake. A separate injunction demanded the immediate dismantling of the drainage pipe and full disclosure of any third-party contractors used. And then came the most satisfying envelope I've ever opened. A letter addressed to me from the Office of the State Environmental Attorney. As the initiating party and primary witness in this matter, your cooperation has been instrumental in the state's enforcement action. We are pursuing civil penalties against the HOA board for unauthorized environmental modification and will be recommending restitution measures be adopted under court supervision. They were going to court. And this time, not as the ones issuing fines, but as the ones answering for them. I made copies and dropped one into Brad's mailbox. No note, no gloating, just facts. At the next HOA meeting, the room was overflowing again. But this time, Brad didn't take the podium. He wasn't there. Instead, an interim board member stood shakily at the mic and read from a prepared statement. Effective immediately. Bradley Whitmore has resigned as president of the Oak Hollow HOA. The board is cooperating fully with state authorities and will be holding a special election to fill vacated seats. The room was quiet. No applause, no jeers. Just a long-held breath finally exhaled. Then someone near the front turned around, looked at me, and gave a quiet nod. Another followed. Then another. No words. Just quiet thanks. That night I stood on my dock, the planks dry and creaky, but still standing, and stared out at the lake. It wasn't healed. Not yet. Maybe not for years. But the bleeding had stopped. And sometimes that's the best first step. The hearing wasn't flashy. No cameras. No dramatic gavel slams like you see on TV. Just fluorescent lights, a tired judge with reading glasses too low on his nose, and a courtroom that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. But in that small county courthouse, sitting behind a scarred wooden table, next to Elaine Turner and a state-appointed counsel, I felt something monumental unfolding. For the first time in a year, the HOA was finally the one answering questions, not asking them. They didn't bring Brad. Of course they didn't. He'd lawyered up weeks before and was conveniently out of state visiting family. In his place sat 2 board members, Margie Fisher and Alan Pike, stiff in their chairs, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. The state's case was clear and damning. Elaine presented the documented violations. Installation of unpermitted drainage infrastructure, absence of engineering certifications, failure to file required environmental impact assessments, breach of the HOA's own governing covenants. Each infraction was backed by photos, measurements, emails, and contractor invoices subpoenaed from outsource environmental solutions. That last one was the kill shot. The invoice from Outsource detailed the project in plain English. Install 6-inch steel outflow pipe at South Shore per HOA President Whitmore's instruction. Target volume release 15,000 gallons SLAR day. No permit required per client's direction. The judge raised an eyebrow. Did the board ever consult a licensed environmental engineer? He asked. Alan looked at Margie. Margie swallowed hard. No, Your Honor, she said softly. Did you notify homeowners of your intent to modify the lake's water retention? No. Did you vote on it during an open meeting? No. Were you aware the pipe would reduce the lake volume by over 4 feet in 3 weeks? A pause. No. Elaine didn't need to gloat. The evidence did the talking. Then it was my turn. The state attorney nodded, and I stood. I took the oath, sat at the witness table, and told my story not with emotion, but with precision. I described the morning Scout growled at the shoreline. I walked the court through my data collection, my warnings, my photos. I laid out the pattern of retaliation, the fines, the false violations, the public shaming. I explained how I had no agenda, except protecting what was never supposed to be in question, the health of our shared land. The judge nodded occasionally, scribbled a few notes. Then toward the end he asked, "Why go to all this trouble, Mr. Hargrove?" I looked at him. Because they were draining more than just water. They were draining trust, community. The kind of quiet peace you only find when your home feels like it's listening to you. That lake raised our children, comforted our grief, brought us together. And they treated it like a nuisance, like a pond to be managed on a spreadsheet. I could feel the stillness in the room. Someone had to say no. He nodded once. That was enough. The judge adjourned for 30 minutes, then returned with his decision. It was swift. I find the Oak Hollow HOA in violation of state environmental regulations, county permit codes, and their own charter. They are hereby ordered to 1. Cease all current and future alterations to the lake. 2. Pay a civil fine of $85,000 to the State Environmental Fund. 3. Provide restitution to the Oak Hollow community in the form of a state-supervised lake restoration project to be completed within 12 months. 4. Hold a new election for the full board within 45 days. Failure to comply will result in further legal action. I didn't smile. I didn't pump my fist. I just breathed. Deep, long, solid. Elaine put her hand on my shoulder as I stood. You did good. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters waited, snapping photos and calling out questions. I ignored them. I wasn't here for headlines. But Dana was. She was standing just beyond the sidewalk, holding 2 cups of coffee. You know, when I moved here, I thought this place was paradise, she said, handing me one. Then the HOA came. I started thinking I was crazy. Like maybe the lake really was dying on its own. But you never flinched. I flinched plenty, I said, smiling weakly. But you stood. She looked me in the eyes. That's more than most. That weekend, the signs started coming down. The orange violation notices, the HOA meeting announcements, the flyers about optimizing the lakefront environment. In their place, a new notice was posted at the clubhouse. Special election notice board, seats open. People read it like it was the first real sunrise after a long storm. I didn't run. I didn't need to. But I did attend the next neighborhood gathering, a potluck near the walking trail. Someone brought smoked brisket. Someone else played guitar. And someone I don't know who handed out little badges shaped like lake reeds that read, "I believed in the water." I clipped mine to my shirt, laughed, and watched the sun dance over what was left of the lake. It wasn't healed yet, but it was free. And now the truth wasn't just known, it was written. In court records, in news articles, in the stories neighbors would tell over fences for years. The morning after the court ruling, something shifted in Oak Hollow, not just in policy, but in spirit. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with balloons or speeches, but you could feel it. The tension that had wrapped itself around our neighborhood like a slow-growing weed was loosening. And in its place, something softer was beginning to grow: trust. The first thing I noticed was the email. Sent from the interim HOA secretary, someone I barely knew before the hearings. It read, "Dear residents, we are initiating a full audit of prior HOA actions, violations, and fines from the last 2 years. If you believe you were wrongly cited or fined, please email our transitional committee. We want to make it right." That word, right. I must have read it 3 times. I forwarded the email to Jorge, the man whose car was towed. He replied with 3 thumbs-up emojis and a message already sent them the bill. Thanks again, man. Then came the apologies. Not all at once, not in grand gestures, but quietly over driveways and mailboxes during walks and dog meetups. Mrs. DeMarco waved me over one morning while I was trimming back my hedges. I was scared, she said. That's why I never spoke up. I thought they'd find me too, or worse. I nodded. You weren't alone. They tried to find me for having a trellis that was too decorative. You believe that? I smiled. Sounds about right. She paused, then without warning, reached out and hugged me. A quick squeeze, a tear in the corner of her eye. We got our neighborhood back, she said. Word traveled fast. The HOA's civil fine, $85,000, was split between the state and a community fund earmarked for environmental restoration. That meant the lake was no longer just an HOA liability, it was a state-supervised recovery zone. The Department of Environmental Protection posted a restoration timeline online. Month 1-2. Remove illegal piping and contaminated soil. Month 3-6. Regrade shoreline and plant native vegetation. Month 7-12. Reintroduce aquatic species and install monitoring sensors. They even opened a volunteer sign-up portal. Dana signed up. So did the Crawfords, the Tanakas, and over 30 more families in the first week. And then, something beautiful happened. Children came back to the water. Not for swimming yet, the algae still needed time, but for curiosity. They walked with parents, poked the mud with sticks, counted tadpoles in shallow pockets. One group even drew sidewalk chalk murals around the edge of the trail. Fish, frogs, birds, and smiling suns. One kid wrote in block letters, "Please don't hurt the lake again." I took a picture, framed it, and for the first time in a long time I slept soundly. Until the phone rang one morning. It was a young woman named Alyssa, an attorney working with the statewide HOA Oversight Initiative. Turns out our case had made waves beyond our county. We've had dozens of complaints filed since your hearing, she said. Your testimony helped spark a legal review of HOA enforcement abuses across multiple districts. Glad it helped, I said cautiously. There's talk of introducing a bill in the next legislative session to limit HOA powers over shared natural resources. They're calling it the Oak Hollow Provision. I sat down slowly. Wait, that's real. It's gaining traction. Your case showed what happens when there's no accountability. I couldn't stop the smile creeping up my face. Later that week, I got another surprise. A young man knocked on my door, tall, nervous, holding a clipboard. Mr. Hargrove, my name's Elijah. I'm running for the new HOA board. A few of us are trying to reform how the HOA operates. More transparency, open meetings, real community involvement. Dana said you might be willing to endorse us. I looked at him. Barely out of college, maybe. But his eyes were steady. I gestured toward the lake. Walk with me. We strolled the familiar trail, still scarred, still healing. I told him what we fought for, what nearly got lost, what still needed guarding. By the time we looped back to the road, I said, "You've got my vote, but more importantly, you've got my help." He smiled wide. That means more than you know. Justice doesn't always come in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes in soft waves, one repaired dock plank, one dropped citation, one child's chalk drawing at a time. And it rippled, not just through Oak Hollow, but through county lines across HOA forums, and into the hands of people who'd once felt powerless. Because when someone stands up not in anger, but in truth, others remember how to stand too. That weekend, we held a lake blessing. It wasn't formal, no clergy, just neighbors bringing flowers, biodegradable candles, and memories. We lined the southern bank, the one once butchered by that pipe, and we let the candles float across what little water had returned. And for the first time in a year, I didn't see shadows. I saw light. It didn't come back all at once. The lake healed, like old bones, slow creaking, unpredictable. For weeks, the water barely shifted. Then, after one long May rain, the surface swelled just enough to kiss the base of the dock again. Not quite like before, but close. Close enough that Scout dipped his paws in without hesitation and looked back at me like, "See, told you it wasn't gone." By midsummer, the wildflowers returned. Goldenrod, black-eyed Susans, purple leucostrife, the same ones my wife used to point out from the porch, naming them like old friends. The frogs came back too croaking loud enough to fill the dusk. Dragonflies skated the water. I saw minnows again, just a few. But enough. Each ripple felt like a promise kept. Restoration crews worked hard, but with care. They didn't bulldoze, they sculpted. Rebuilt the bank with native stone, laid down choir logs to prevent future erosion, and invited the community to plant marsh grasses alongside them. I brought my shovel and a folding chair. We worked beside children, retirees, young couples who'd just moved in. Some brought lunch. One kid wore a shirt that said Team Lake in crayon lettering. When he handed me a juice box, I nearly lost it. I'd spent months in battle mode, documents, hearings, violations, testimonies. Now I had to learn how to be still again, to breathe without waiting for the next strike. It wasn't easy. Trauma doesn't punch and leave. It lingers, especially when it came from the place you called home. But healing began too, not just for the lake, for me. I rebuilt the cedar bench, the original one they'd vandalized. This time I carved a quote into the backrest, something simple. Something I'd heard my wife say after her last round of chemo as we sat on that very spot years ago. We protect what we love, or we lose it. Neighbors noticed. One by one they started coming by, sitting beside me. Not to rehash the past, but to simply exist in the present. In peace. In witness. Dana came often. She brought Scout peanut butter treats, brought me hot coffee. Some mornings we said nothing at all. Just watched the wind ripple the water and listened to the hum of life returning. In September, the lake hit 90% of its original volume. The department issued a report noting substantial ecological recovery. But I didn't need a report. I had birdsong. I had sunlight flickering across calm water. I had laughter from across the trail. One evening during a neighborhood gathering, a motion passed unanimously to rename the dock Hargrove's Landing. I tried to protest, really, but they wouldn't have it. You saved it, Dana said, clinking her glass to mine. Now let it carry your name. I didn't know how to carry that honor, but I did know how to sit quietly and be grateful. A few months later, a new sign went up at the lake trail entrance. Oak Hollow Nature Commons. Protected Watershed Community Stewardship Zone. Below it, a list of names of volunteer stewards. Mine was there, so was Dana's. So were the Crawfords, the Tanaka's Jorge, and even little Elijah, who'd gone on to win the HOA presidency by a landslide, with a campaign centered around transparency and environmental respect. Funny thing was, he never once mentioned me in his speeches. He didn't need to. The lake had spoken loud enough, and it kept speaking. On the anniversary of the court ruling, we held a remembrance walk. Not a protest, not a rally, just a walk. Slow, gentle. Families, singles, elders, with canes and kids with fishing poles. Scout trotted ahead, older, now grayer in the muzzle, but proud, tail high, like he knew. We ended at the dock. Candles were lit. A violin played. I was asked to say something. I kept it brief. This lake taught me patience. It taught me to fight without hate, to stand without shouting, and to believe that truth matters even when it's inconvenient. I looked out over the water. Thank you all for listening, for fighting too. Later that night back home, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photo. An aerial shot of the lake full again, surrounded by color and life. On the back, someone had written, "You turn the tide, forever grateful." No signature. I placed it next to the framed chalk drawing from that kid, "Please don't hurt the lake again." Side by side, they said everything that needed saying. I sat on the bench again that evening. The light was low gold and forgiving. Scout rested his chin on my boot. The lake was still, alive, and I was home.